Welcome to Immigration and Mobility Decoded, Episode 2. It's Tuesday, March 14th, and we have a great episode ahead for y'all. Our conversation with Arif Khimani, President and Chief Operating Officer at Mobsquad. But before we get there, Finn, I just want to spend a couple of minutes just recapping the last week or so.
We are really fighting for spring here in Maine. It's a battle every day between rain and snow at this point. I'm happy if it's rain. It's just going to help the grass grow greener faster. So really just here praying for warm weather. How's it for you guys over in the Midwest in Chicago?
It's a little bit weird. It's kind of been snowing the last couple days, and I feel like it's been snowing and colder these last few days, more so than like the entire month of February. So it's just a reminder that winter in Chicago doesn't really end until, I don't know, late March, May, sometimes even early June. Who knows? Just depends on the year. But the big thing is daylight savings time. This clock switch is just messing with my body and my overall level of attention. Is it affecting you as much as it's affecting me?
For sure. It always takes a couple of days to get used to. I mean, we'll talk a lot on this podcast about what Congress is doing on all sorts of immigration bills, but they do have a bill underway right now to just eliminate daylight savings time altogether, which depending on what time of year you ask me, I'm in favor of. And if you ask me on Sunday morning whether or not I'm in favor of eliminating daylight savings, I would say yes.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. My wife and I were talking about that yesterday. And last year in Congress, the Senate legislation proposed by Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, passed the Senate unanimously. Like, if I recall correctly, it was like a voice vote. And just think about our, the current structure of the legislative branch. When was the last time anything passed unanimously? And the House just never took it up, and it's baffling.
Yeah, it's there's a lobby behind it. Actually, I can't think of the organization's name, but I remember reading an article about it. And there's all these statistics they cite for why the case behind why daylight savings time should be eliminated. And heart attacks and heart-related medical emergencies increase significantly in the November fallback when you lose or is it spring forward? Whatever time of the year when you lose an hour of sleep, the rate of heart issues increases significantly in that 24-hour period afterwards because people don't get as much sleep.
I mean, it's just going off of my experience these last 2 days. I slept in till like 11:30 yesterday, but that's just because we thought it was 10:30, and I'm in favor of the daylight savings like time. I'm just not in favor of the clock switch anymore. When I was younger, it affected me, but just as we've gotten older, it just confuses me. Like, why are we still doing this? There's no point to it. And let's just get that legislation moving.
Speaking of losing sleep, there are hundreds of thousands of H-1B prospective applicants right now who are waiting on their hopeful lottery selection. But I imagine daylight savings isn't helping their stress levels right now either.
No, totally. And the lottery registration period closes this Friday, March 17th. Let me make sure I got my dates right. Yes, yep. Friday, March 17th. So, so I mean, Finn, and just if you want to remind our audience, registration period opened up earlier this month and it closes the 17th. So employers have until the 17th to submit registrations. And then what happens afterwards?
Right. So then March 31st, USCIS says that it intends to notify selected registrants. Last year, I believe they selected about 120,000 or so folks out of the lottery. And our listeners might know that being selected in the lottery doesn't guarantee you're going to get an H-1B approval. It just means that USCIS is actually going to assess your application. all of the lottery submissions that are not selected basically just get thrown out by USCIS. They're not going to consider it. So then after March 31st in April, that's when USCIS will allow employers to begin filing the H-1B cap subject petitions for any of the registrants, any of the foreign nationals who were selected at the end of March there.
Got it. Thanks for that recap. It's a lot of important dates coming up to remember. And then throughout this, if someone is selected throughout this process, then they would, and everything goes accordingly, they'd be able to start their employment on October 1st. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. There's sort of two ways to get an H-1B petition, right? There's a change of status, which means you're already in the U.S. And once your H-1B is approved sometime in the next few months here, hopefully by USCIS, you'd be able to transition from whatever your current visa status is to an H-1B. Or if you're outside of the U.S., you can get a visa stamp for your H-1B petition once it's approved and then enter the U.S. after October 1st. Obviously, that varies depending on certain situations, but that's sort of the main two options for H-1B applicants.
Yeah. And Finn, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention following that you and I are not attorneys. So again, if you do have any legal questions or have any legal questions, definitely recommend speaking to an attorney for further information.
100%. And we'll put the links to the USCIS pages in the show notes as well.
Totally. Finn, as we move into our immigration news recap, one article that I wanted to just get your talk with you about briefly, it came across my feed last week, and it's from Politico. No avoiding it now. Immigration issues threaten Biden's climate program. So for some quick context, last year, the government and President Biden signed two pieces of legislation, actually three to talk about here. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. All three of them, essentially boil down to, building and enhancing America's infrastructure, whether it's roads and bridges, public transportation, or in the case of the CHIPS and Science Act, boosting the semiconductor industry and providing those incentives for companies like NVIDIA to produce their semiconductors or chips here in the United States. The immigration angle to this, according to Politico, is that there are not enough Americans to meet the job demand or the future job demand, to help these companies really invest and build this infrastructure. The article then goes into just talking about the current immigration setup, which if you're listening to this, and Finn, you know pretty well of just the some of the restrictions the U.S. immigration system has. I think given that we're in H-1B season, I think that's a good example of there's only 85,000 H-1B visas available, and last year over 480,000 people submitted registrations, and you're likely going to see the same, if not higher, number this year in terms of electronic registration submitted. And so I just thought it was an interesting look at these massive pieces of legislation and tying it to just the workforce in general, and it's just the legislators, business executives recognize the need for more individuals to help fill the labor demands. Finn, what are your thoughts on I guess in general on these pieces of legislation and knowing what of we focus a lot on the high skill part at Envoy Global, but a lot of these jobs, will be helped building these massive factories, roads, bridges, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conundrum, right? Because while these pieces of legislation are well intended, right, to be job creators in key industries, key sectors that are important for the country's critical infrastructure, they sometimes are short-sighted in the fact that immigrant labor has always been a key piece of the puzzle when it comes to progress in the country, right? In every sector, from what are considered higher skill trades to what are sometimes considered lower skill trades. But when it comes to critical infrastructure and building clean energy infrastructure and microchips that we need here at home, you'd think that it would make maybe a bit more sense to call anyone working on those projects critical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And immigrant labor makes up a big part of that. I think it's interesting in that Politico article you mentioned at the very end, Teresa Cardinal Brown, who's an immigration policy expert at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a DC-based think tank, had a quote saying Canada literally places billboards in Washington state saying, immigrants come over here, right? Come to Canada. And that's something we talk with Arif in our conversation today a lot about, right? That Canada set up their immigration policy and their immigration system in a way where if they pass a bill like this, or if they pass bills that are going to, create a requirement for skilled, unskilled labor to come in and help build these new projects or manage these new initiatives, they have a very rapid system set up so that they're able to bring in foreign talent to help fill some of those labor gaps that can't be met by native labor. And I'm excited to have the audience hear what Arif thinks about that.
Yeah, totally. And I think to add to that, it's across these labor shortages, span almost all the job titles that you can think of. Here in the article references, electrical engineers, foreign-born construction labor. So it spans the gamut in terms of where these job openings are. Something else that caught my eye in this article, which we'll link below, is that the reporter says that there are discrete discussions going on about immigration legislation, particularly among Senators Tim Kaine and Lindsey Graham. According to Politico, they have discussed legislation to help support people with temporary protected status, which I thought was interesting. Early in this year, we haven't heard too much about immigration legislation, so we'll keep an eye on that and see where that goes. And I think final thing from my end is it's not just the green industry that has these labor shortages. Politico says, quote, immigration restrictions are even hindering oil and gas companies right now, and that's according to a representative from Texas. So it's just a really interesting thing, and I think it just adds further evidence to everything that we've been seeing, throughout these last couple of years. The recent 2023 Immigration Trends Report that there are these massive job openings, and there's legislators, business community again, I think are kind of ringing the bell that immigration reform is needed in some way.
Yeah, there's a lot of advocacy for it. There's a lot of strong voices, like you said, Senator Tim Kaine, Senator Lindsey Graham, and others with a lot of political capital in Washington who are in support of making common sense, widely supported improvements to the immigration system to fill some of these gaps that are being highlighted in Politico's reporting and others. But I mean, for those listening, whether you're a foreign national employee stuck in the backlog, an employer an HR at a company who is involved in the immigration function pretty closely, or an immigration lawyer, anyone else, and you've followed policy developments and political developments on employment-based immigration and immigration in general in DC, unfortunately, it's unlikely this is going to go anywhere in the next year or so. Eric, I wanted to get your thoughts on a topic related to that. Not even though we just sort of poo-pooed the idea of much getting done in DC, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy from Illinois' 8th congressional district introduced a bill last week, I believe, titled the press release says it's a bill to improve the legal immigration system and eliminate visa backlogs. I haven't looked into the details too much, but the bare bones of the bill is essentially there are per country green card caps that disproportionately impact Indian and Chinese immigrants in this country, who have to wait decades or more sometimes to even qualify to apply for a green card because of these annual per country green card caps. And this bill would seek to improve that with a few different by pulling a few different levers. I wonder if you have any reaction to that, Eric.
I think any news on immigration legislation is good news, and I'd be curious to see where this goes. I think it's just another example or another good indication of eliminating or the green card backlog or doing something about it is top of mind or is at the forefront for some legislators. At the end of last year, I know there was a lot of movement in Congress, particularly on the Senate side, to my memory is a little bit hazy, to address the green card backlog. I'd have to look up specifics. So I think it's good that Representative I'm going to mispronounce his last name.
Krishnamurthy. Yeah,
Krishnamurthy. There we go. Is introducing this legislation. How would I know the details are a little bit scarce right now, but Finn, just based off of your knowledge of the green card backlog, visa bulletin, et cetera, how would a eliminate green card backlog act work in theory?
So, right, there's two ways being discussed. There's multiple ways to go about it, and there's lots of folks who are much smarter than I who know the issue much more deeply, who can elaborate on all of the different options available. But the two that seem to encompass the majority of the conversation, the two options available are either remove the per country green card caps, right? So I just mentioned that those disproportionately impact Indian and Chinese immigrants here, just because there tends to be a high volume of Indian nationals and Chinese nationals who immigrate to the U.S. on employment-based visas and other visa types, right? And because they're only allotted a few thousand green cards each year within their specific employment-based green card category, it becomes very, very difficult for them to even get close enough to the front of the line where they can apply for a green card. So that's option one. Option two is just increase the overall number of green cards and employment-based green cards available each year, which Congress could do.
Yeah,
we actually asked that question in our immigration trends report, and 58% in our immigration trends survey, and 58% of the 500 plus HR professionals who we surveyed said that they were in favor of just increasing the overall number of employment-based green cards available each year. And about 40% said they prefer option one, just removing the per country green card caps that, again, disproportionately impact Indian and Chinese green card applicants.
Does the green card cap kind of help explain the government failing to utilize a certain number of visas in the representative state press release? He says, quote, U.S. immigration officials failed to utilize approximately 9,100 employment-based visas in fiscal year 2020 and over 66,000 in fiscal year 2021.
That's just USCIS incompetence, unfortunately. And it being, part of the executive branch and being subject to politics and changes in administration can certainly impact the agency's ability to operate smoothly. Which is again why.
And lack of manpower at times.
Lack of manpower, lack of maybe modern modern processes for adjudicating immigration applications. All of that's a real problem. There's calls across the board from the business community, from the foreign national community, just from Americans who are who understand how fraught and how slow the system can be for USCIS to make improvements. On that note, one other newsworthy topic I wanted to bring up was that USCIS did announce last week that they are expanding premium processing, the ability to obtain premium processing for certain F1 students seeking OPT or STEM OPT extensions. Don't want to go too into the weeds on this announcement, but essentially, anyone who's an F1 student, who's a foreign immigrant student studying here, has the ability to get up to 1 year of work authorization on the OPT program. And then if they're in a STEM field, they have the ability to get up to 2 additional years, so 3 years in total of work authorization on the STEM OPT program. OPT stands for Optional Practical Training. And then after that, they need to find a visa like an H-1B, an employer-sponsored visa, to continue working here. That system has always been frustrating for many foreign nationals who are on F1 visas because it can sometimes be very slow to extend your OPT or STEM OPT status in the past. And so the introduction of premium processing right around H-1B cap season, and a lot of folks who are applying for the H-1B cap are going to be foreign nationals who are on F1 OPT or F1 STEM OPT. That will hopefully make a real difference and is a good sign of USCIS, moving towards a more digital system. Sorry, I forgot to mention that as part of this announcement, USCIS is allowing some applicants to apply for premium processing through an online filing of the premium processing form. So good news on that front, at least.
Definitely agree. Definitely good news. I think the final news item that I want to just quickly bring up is by the time most people are listening to this, the comment period will have ended, but USCIS did extend the comment period on the increase on immigration fees. It was originally supposed to run until March 6th, but it was extended until yesterday, March 13th. So we'll see what happens next. But some of these, fee increases, Finn, to your point, USCIS is a fee-based agency, and a couple of years ago they were facing some operating difficulties due to lack of funding and whatnot. So we'll keep an eye out on this one as well and see what USCIS says regarding these proposed fee updates. So with that, Finn, I think we're ready to hop into our conversation with Arif Khimani. Anything else top of mind for our listeners that you want to share?
No, just really excited to share our conversation with Arif. He's a really smart guy, really knowledgeable about working with companies and foreign national employees who are making that transition into the Canadian immigration system. And we really dive deep with him about the differences between the U.S. and the Canadian immigration system, and where, as we highlighted in some of the news stories today, where the Canadian immigration system, tackles certain issues and problems that it has much quicker and much more efficiently than we do here in the U.S. So excited for that, Eric.
Totally. Same here. Always enjoy speaking with Arif, and the conversation is also super timely. again, we are in the midst of H-1B cap season, and Canada has positioned itself as an H-1B alternative, and ARF speaks more to how employers can, look to Canada to hire or retain the talent, foreign talent, as they wish. All right, so with that, let's hop into our conversation with Arif Khimani, the President and Chief Operating Officer of Mobsquad. Oh, Arif, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me.
Super excited for our conversation. Our conversation today is going to focus a lot on Canadian immigration, the system, everything from the policies to H-1B Canada's an H-1B alternative, and much, much more. But Arif, before we get there, I just want to give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself to our audience for those who might be unfamiliar with you. Just want to learn more about, your background, how you got involved with the company, and how you got involved with Canadian immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit of background. I was born and raised in Vancouver in Canada. I graduated from UBC out in the province of BC, and spent the first part of my career working in Toronto for Procter & Gamble, then moved back to Vancouver to work for Amazon in Vancouver, both in finance-related roles. So done everything from sales finance to brand management finance to operations finance, and was wanting to get more into something that I had a lot of passion for and had some purpose behind it. And that's where my career started with Mobsquad. It was actually founded by Arif Khimani, who's now our founder and executive chair. And the reason I brought up UBC is he was one of my professors back at UBC.
Nice.
And so we had, and so we'd kept in touch over the years. And, he had sent out a note saying, we're starting this thing. We've, raised some funds. We think it's a really good idea. If you're interested in learning more, let me know. And I put my hand up, and when he was explaining it, it was kind of this perfect marriage of, something I was really interested in was getting involved in the startup space. But also something that had really meaningful purpose in terms of what it was doing in trying to help people build better lives for themselves in Canada. And we'll certainly get into the company, as we go down, as well as just an opportunity to work with really, really awesome people. And so that's how I ended up joining Mobsquad.
That's awesome. That's an awesome story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I hope Irfan's doing well. It's been a while since I have spoken to him. I think I've technically known Irfan since like 2018 or so. So yeah, no, you guys are awesome, and yeah, I can't tell you how much it means to have you as the officially second ever guest on our show. So yeah, that's thank you so much. So Arif, just also curious, we know your background with Mobsquad, but what are your hobbies and interests outside of work?
Yeah, of course. So, a few things that I love. I love music, live shows and concerts, and just general things about that. As I'm sure if my team will be listening to this, will laugh because I'm very strongly opinionated about what I like and don't like in music and pop culture.
What are some examples?
I'm a big, I'm pretty genre agnostic. Like I love, electronic music, rap, hip hop, rock, like kind of all over, and going all the way from 60s to now.
Yeah.
So I'm, kind of all over the place. I just love a good live show. And I one of my favorite things is getting into an artist that you didn't really know that you see it either opening for someone else or at a festival or something. And it's a very cool, cool feeling. Otherwise, super into sports, huge basketball fan, big Raptors fan, used to be a season ticket holder when I lived in Toronto. I don't play as much because I'm terrible, but I enjoy watching basketball. And then hockey, of course, being Canadian, a big fan of hockey, try to play once a week and then also, watch as much as I can.
Totally. Who's the team you root for?
I am a Canucks fan, which has been a tough slog for the last 10 or 15 years here, but hopefully things will turn around.
Definitely. I'm sure you've had your fair share of heartbreak come Stanley Cup playoff time. Although I will say, being in Chicago in some of those playoff series between the Canucks and Blackhawks and early 2010s where just a thing of beauty, just going back and forth. And the Canucks had the Blackhawks for a while there, if I recall correctly. So yeah.
I mean, you definitely had us early. But one series that we did beat you, where we went all the way to the Cup final, was definitely one of the highlights of
2011. Yep. That was, And even then, I think wasn't that a 7-game series as well, or might be off on that one.
I believe so. Yeah, I think it was. My memory has become terrible these days, but I believe so.
So in addition to watching sports, anything that you're currently watching in terms of, movies, TV series? I mean, there's just so much out there, but anything at the top of your watch list?
Yeah, I mean, I somehow find a way to consume a lot of content. It's kind of what relaxes me at the end of the day, so get through quite a lot. Currently watching The Last of Us. I don't know if you're watching that on HBO.
Oh, hell yeah, yes.
Really, really well
Great
done.
show.
I didn't actually play the game, but which I think is great because it's also a surprise to me. But I think they're doing an amazing job. I thought Andor was really, really good on Disney. Probably the best Star Wars programming since the original trilogy in my mind. And super excited for Succession coming back later this month. So it's another favorite of mine.
Totally.
Arif, who's your favorite Canadian actor? You got a lot of good ones who've come out of the north there.
That's a good question. I mean, I think Ryan Reynolds is pretty popular right now. He's super fun. But going back, Jim Carrey was always a favorite, especially when I was young with Ace Ventura and The Mask and all of that. But yeah, we do have quite a few actors and artists actually.
Yeah, The Last of Us, amazing show. As someone who like played the game, I'm not as opinionated on like video game adaptations, but it is by far the best video game adaptation that I've seen, and it is such a great show. And I think, fun fact too, and kind of relation, a lot of it was filmed in parts of Canada. So I remember there's one. I think early in like the second episode, they had a little thing. It's like 10 miles outside of Boston, and you can see like a mountain and a river, and everyone was kind of like, "Yeah, I'm not sure about that one," but it was just because they were filmed in Canada.
Yeah, it's a lot in Calgary, where our headquarters is actually, and near Canmore, which is just outside of Calgary. Yeah. So, having spent a couple of years there, you can definitely recognize some of the areas of Canada, and not quite Boston.
Got it. So
recently. Oh, sorry, Eric.
No. Go. Yeah, go.
I was going to say, I recently learned that most Hallmark movies are actually filmed in Canada as well. All those Hallmark Christmas movies, I guess they just like to use the magic that is Central Canada to film those.
I did not know that. I can't say I watch a lot of those, but that's good to know.
I begrudgingly learned that this holiday season.
Begrudgingly, nice. So, Arif, sounds like you've lived in quite a few different places throughout the country of Canada. What's your favorite part about living in Canada? Yeah,
I mean, I was thinking about this, and there's a few things. Obviously, I think it has really amazing cities and tons of natural beauty and things to do, but the thing that for me has always stood out is the people. So whether that's been in Vancouver, Toronto, or Calgary, there's just great people everywhere. It's a really multicultural, diverse country. But the thing that kind of is a through line is that people are super friendly, really kind, really welcoming, and a lot of fun. And there's a really awesome just embrace of different cultures across the country. And so you'll very easily be able to find, dozens of countries worth of cuisines in any major city. There's lots of arts and culture related to the different communities that are out here. And so it's always just awesome because you get to experience so much of what is offered in the world without having to leave your city, just because there's such a great diverse group of people that's really embraced, and it's a lot of fun.
Totally. Final question for you. You mentioned cuisine. What, in your opinion, is two-parter? The best Canadian food dish, and then what's the best Canadian beer?
Sure, yes. I mean, for food dish, I mean, not to stereotype, but if it's got to be Canadian, it's probably got to be poutine. I mean, it's just, I can't understand why that hasn't taken off in the U.S. because it's a combination of fries, gravy, and cheese.
It's the best. Yeah,
everything in there is perfect. I know Finn was saying he goes up to Montreal a lot, which is it's pretty popular out there. So I mean, as far as Canadian dishes, that's definitely up there. In terms of beer, I would say similar to the U.S., the best thing is actually just all the different craft and kind of microbreweries that are around. So
Hmm.
if you're in Vancouver, there's a great one called House of Funk. In Calgary, there's a really fun one called Cold Garden, and in Toronto, there's one called Blood Brothers. They're all just why I like those ones is they brew pretty unique and interesting stuff, and they take chances and kind of just have very fun options. And so those are just some of my favorites. And I just recommend doing kind of brewery crawls if you're ever in any of those cities because they all have lots of good options.
Totally, you can never go wrong with a citywide brewery crawl. I think it's probably one of my favorite activities, particularly in the summer. And to your point about poutine not taking off, it just sparked a memory in me. I live in, so I'm in Chicago, and a couple of years ago, there's a stretch in a neighborhood of the city called Logan Square, and there used to be this little joint that served poutine. And it was one of those late night spots. It was open like till three in the morning, and you go there at one,
Mm-hmm.
2, and it was chef's kiss going there at after midnight, and they unfortunately closed down. I don't even like 2017, and it was pretty sad to see them go because it was a good spot.
That's a shame.
Well, while Americans are failing to import poutine from Canada, we are exporting a lot of our foreign talent up to you in Canada, and we kind of want to start to ask you about that, Arf, about that trend, and unpack all of that for us. But first, I was hoping, most of the audience will probably be U.S.-based folks, and some might be familiar with the Canadian immigration system. It's difficult to really bring up U.S. employment-based immigration without bringing up Canada, because it's become such an important part of the system here. But I was hoping you could unpack just sort of the political breakdown on immigration in Canada, but in particular employment-based immigration. In the U.S., it's fairly known that there's a couple of Democrats, a couple of Republicans who are very vocally outspoken about the need to bring in talent from overseas. But it's very partisan for the most part in the overall conversation of immigration. In Canada, I've heard a few interviews with the Conservative leader there. Seems like for the most part, he's on board with increasing, the number of immigrants that Canada brings in. And meanwhile, the Trudeau government is doing the same thing. So could you unpack the landscape politically in Canada when it comes to immigration?
Yeah, of course. And I think you've already done a great summary there. Like I would say, by and large, the attitude towards immigration in Canada is that immigration and newcomers are a force for good, and that they contribute to the country both economically and culturally and in all aspects. And that has generally led to a sentiment where immigration numbers have increased in Canada over time, regardless of political party that's been in charge. And normally when we do webinars, we actually have a chart that kind of shows first that if you were to go back 25, 30 years, you'd see a steady increase in just the number of immigrants and newcomers coming to Canada. And then if you were to overlay that with like parties in charge, even as the parties have changed, you would see that those numbers have continued to rise. And we'll get into some of this later, but there is survey data that also shows that Canadians look at immigration as being positive, which helps kind of take that off the table for being a political lightning rod of any kind. And part of this is just because, similar to the U.S., Canada has combined immigration plans, right? So if you look at it, there's economic migrants, there's family reunification, and then there's cases like refugees or those facing different global crises. If you look at this split in Canada of what that is, the economic portion is always the largest bucket. So the number one source of immigrants and newcomers is economic migrants. It's typically 60% or higher of the people that are coming in. And so when people think about immigration and when they think about people coming to the country, they generally, the first thought is they work, they're helping the GDP, they're helping to grow the economy, they're contributing to the country. And that's quite different than the numbers in the US, where the number of economic migrants is 20% or less. So it's a lot more family reunification, diversity visa lottery, and other places where the sentiment towards immigration is just not that strong, which is why the political will, even on either side, is actually to either keep the status quo or reduce immigration, versus in Canada where it's actually quite strong to increase immigration. And so that's, something that we've seen regardless of political lines, just because even if you were to watch Canadian debates when, where there's a political election, the question is not, should we have immigration? It's generally just how much and some of the more specific nuances around it. But the answer to immigration has always generally been yes.
And it's interesting because one thing I hear often amongst policymakers in the U.S. who tout Canada's immigration system as a blueprint for us is, in the U.S. we set a cap for the number of immigrants we let in each year. In Canada, each year you set new levels for how many immigrants you want to welcome in. Can you unpack the immigration levels plan that Canada has and how that works?
Yeah, of course. And so a little bit of background there is every year Canada sets a 3-year target for immigration, which is basically called the Immigration Levels Plan. And so it announces two things. One is the overall immigration targets by year. So how many net new people do they want to bring in as permanent residents or citizens? The second piece is how that splits up amongst economic, family causes, refugees, and humanitarian causes. So you can see Canada wants to bring in X number of immigrants, and here's how it will break down by the targets. And they give a little bit of wiggle room there. So there's a range of, low and high on both the overall target as well as the individual sections. But that is basically announced on an annual basis and updated for 3 years out. And if you were to look at the most recent levels plan, it basically projected record immigration for each of 23, 24, and 25, with a total of 500,000 immigrants in 2025, which would be the largest number ever in Canada. So to your earlier point, they announced that plan, and it is trending in that same direction that we've been seeing from the previous years, where it continues to set new records every year.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's very much in contrast with the approach that we have here. I know Eric has some questions for you related to that.
Yeah, Arif, as Finn was alluding to, here in the States, there's just constant news on immigration. A lot of it, as you mentioned, focused on humanitarian aspect of it. I'm curious how the coverage and like the news alerts are in Canada as well. Like any recent news updates that our audience or that you would like to share, particularly around the speed at which Canada can implement its changes to its immigration system. I think that's what always has been the most fascinating thing to me when learning about Canada and how it approaches immigration. It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that the Canadian government is able to make these changes at a more robust pace compared to the U.S., where it has to go through both chambers of Congress, then be signed by the president. And to Finn's earlier point, there's just this the political debates often means that legislation doesn't move forward, but when I am on BBC, I feel if I see these changes, it kind of reflects the speed at which Canada can move.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, the system is just a lot nimbler in terms of being able to respond to what's going on in the current market, which is, when you think about immigration, extremely important, because if your number one target for immigration is economic migrants, what you really want to be able to do is make sure that you're targeting those that would help fill labor gaps in the country and help actually contribute to the economy where it's most needed, right? So if you're bringing in folks where there's very little, need for those individuals in roles, it's kind of setting up a lose-lose, because you're saturating the market with people that you may not necessarily need, and you're bringing in people that won't be able to find the jobs that you want them to be able to find and be successful in the country, right? So having that agility, I think, is really important and super helpful. And there's a few examples of this, I think, that are helpful. So one is there's a program in Canada called the Global Talent Stream. And not to get too in the weeds, but typically if you want to bring talent into Canada under the normal system, you have to do what's called a labor market impact assessment, which is basically to say that you have made efforts to hire someone locally. It has not been successful. and there is a shortage, and that is, therefore why you are looking to hire foreign talent, because there's the market doesn't allow you to do that locally. What the global talent stream did was basically streamline a lot of that process, where it said, we've already, it's effectively saying that we already know we have a shortage of technology workers, which is where this program is focused. Just based on the data, based on, employment rates, based on the number of the demand for those roles, the number of open positions, like all of this data that basically shows that there's way more open roles than there are people to do those roles. And that is a problem that's only going to get exacerbated if we don't help try and solve it through something like immigration. And so it created an expedited stream where if you are, in a qualified company in Canada, importantly, if you're willing to do things that help improve the lives of Canadians and permanent residents through what's called a labor market benefits plan. So this could be through hiring Canadians, hosting events related to diversity and underrepresentation, hiring interns, working with universities, all kinds of things that benefit the country as a whole. So if you're a company that's willing to do all of that, and you're hiring within these specific sectors, so things like software engineering, data science, machine learning, AI, all the hot, top occupations that you would think about, you can essentially have people from anywhere in the world working for your company in as little as 4 weeks. And this is a program that's available year round, and it's not capped similar to the H-1B at like 85,000. It's really based on market demand, right? So it really changed the dynamic of how we're able to hire, because we know there's a software engineering talent shortage. And if you can basically look around the world and have people join your team within a month, that's a lot different and a lot more, useful than having to wait several months or a year to get something like that. So that's an example of a program that was created by the government originally as a pilot. It was super successful. It's doing what it's supposed to do. It's bringing in the right talent, and these companies are helping Canada long term. It was, then made into a permanent program. But that's an example of something that was just introduced, piloted, successful, and then, made permanent.
That's super interesting, and just fascinating to hear you describe the nimbleness the nimbleness from the government, where they identified a problem and were able to introduce a pilot program and then just implement it full time. So I'm curious. You mentioned shortage of occupations such as tech workers, software engineers, etc. Maybe a bigger picture, how are demographics influencing the government's approach to immigration?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good question. And, I think by and large, Canada is similar to many, Western European countries and the US in that we have an aging population. People are having less kids, and therefore the average age of the population is going to increase if we continue to do that. And so that's just going to be more people needing social services with less people able to actually contribute to those services, right? So that, I think, is a primary catalyst for why immigration is being used as a tool to help solve that, because there's a few ways to solve this. One is you encourage people to have children, which is, you can only do so much of that, and people are only going to do what they're going to do. Yeah. The other is you can just bring talent in that's in that prime kind of earning stage of their lives, right? So if you bring in the most in-demand talent from around the world that are the most highly skilled and highly trained individuals, and they, then choose to make Canada their home as a long-term place, they will be contributing to the GDP, contributing to the economy, paying taxes, both, sales taxes and income taxes, and, building that tax base for the country so that we can successfully, de-age the population through a really, really effective means. And you're actually, you have some control over this in that you can select like where you have that demand, right? So right now, technology is obviously a huge area for that. But that can change, and you can adapt based on, what that might be. And so, I think that's how demographics influence policy, is that an aging population that's getting more reliant on services requires you to bring in a younger group so that you can grow your GDP, grow your economy, and remain competitive, as a G7 country.
Super interesting. You mentioned there is no like H-1B-esque type visa in Canada, or in terms of like there's a lottery. We're gonna hit on that a little bit more in a second, and some more differences between Canadian immigration system and the US immigration system. But Arif, first, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, are there any similarities between the US and Canadian immigration systems?
I think there are some. I think, there are systems in place that distinguish between economic immigration and other categories like family reunification and humanitarian refugee type causes. So we have that in terms of like those buckets exist, I think, across both countries. I think there is, similarity in that there's occupational focus on what you're targeting. Like the example that I gave with the global talent stream is largely focused on technology and now some additional engineering fields. Similarly, the H-1B obviously has a list of occupations that are eligible to even apply for that, right? So you can't just apply as any role. Like there's priority given to the roles that in theory are the most in demand to fill that cap, right? And in the US, I know that is largely also technology focused. And then there's similarities as well, just on some of the conditions that you need to meet to hire foreign nationals. So similar to how the H-1B has prevailing wages for, depending on the market you're hiring, you have to pay people a certain salary or wage. That exists in Canada as well, where, if you're hiring engineers in Toronto, that could be different than in Calgary or Vancouver, just based on local market median wages that have to be met so that you're not basically using foreign talent to undercut the local market. So that's something that's not allowed. And I think that's similar to both countries. So there's definitely similarity. I think the execution is quite different between the countries, but the principles on those nature, I think, are pretty similar.
Another aspect of the system that relates to demographics relates to the economic drivers behind the Canadian immigration system. And it's something that's been proposed here in the U.S. Is a state-based immigration system. Canada has a provincial-based immigration, or has provincial-based immigration programs, correct?
Yeah, so it's interesting on how that works, because similar to the U.S., immigration is a federal stream. So, the government of Canada, similar to the U.S. government, does have ultimate control over the immigration policy in the country. But what Canada allows for, which is interesting, is they have certain numbers of what they call provincial nominations that each province gets, where they can nominate people for permanent residency, which is the equivalent of a U.S. green card in Canada, based on criteria that is specific to that province and the needs of that province. So it's probably easier with an example. There's a program in Alberta called the Alberta Accelerated Tech Program that was created, relatively recently, about a year ago. And it basically allows Alberta to prioritize those within technology roles for permanent residency by giving them a nomination to the province of Alberta. And so what that would mean is that you would apply federally for your, permanent residency, but then you would indicate interest in Alberta. And if you're a valid employer in Alberta, you would basically say, hey, I want to hire this individual. I want to support them through the stream. We have a role for them. You meet all that criteria. And that individual basically gets a ton of additional points, which makes it a lot easier for them to get their PR in Canada. That individual commits to, living in Alberta, while that's being obtained, and basically the company commits to having the role for them active for at least a year after they achieve their PR, so that they, are able to stay for that. But it's an example of a program where the provinces have some control, and they can see like, what type of worker do we need? Where are we short of people? How do we think about that? And then they can develop programs that are specific for that. So that's an example. There's other provinces that use, where they need workers in more rural areas. And so they'll prioritize people that are willing to live outside of maybe the major cities and develop some of the rural areas. So it allows for more flexibility, which I think is the key takeaway, is that is more responsive to the needs of that specific province, right? So similar to the US, like what California needs may be quite different than what, Wyoming might need. And this allows some of that discretion at the provincial level while still keeping a federal system.
Yeah, it's a fascinating system. I think just last week, the governors of Indiana and Utah proposed a state-based visa program here in the U.S. And Envoy has a blog coming out in a couple of weeks, really highlighting all of the growing tech hubs in Canada and how they're not. Vancouver's obviously a big one, Toronto, Waterloo, but there's the Canadian immigration system is really filtering foreign talent across the country. so that there's sort of a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Whereas in the U.S., Silicon Valley, Seattle, New York are kind of the famous tech hubs, but Cleveland and Boise aren't as well known for attracting foreign talent to work in STEM positions. You touched a little bit.
No,
on,
and I mean,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that this, it really works. Like, we are operational in Vancouver, Toronto, Halifax, and Calgary. So we're nationwide, and we can see when provinces decide to do certain things. Like, that actually influences the decisions of companies we work with, as well as the talent that we're hiring in terms of where they want to go. So it can really actually influence decision making and actually cause people to choose where to be based on, what's available.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a very altruistic, smart approach that we just have failed to act on here in the U.S. But you touched on the points-based system that you have in Canada a little bit. I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit more, and also tell us about the permanent residency process in Canada for immigrants.
Yeah, of course, and that's quite different in the U.S. So it's definitely worth spending a little bit of time there. So. I know the U.S. has, the green card system, which has country caps. And so every year, only certain numbers of individuals from any particular country could get nominated for a green card or earn a green card. And for some countries like India, that list is, upwards of 10 or 20 years. And so it can take a really long time to actually be able to achieve that. The Canadian system is quite different in that it's all, at least for the major PR stream, which is called Express Entry PR. It is focused on a point-based system. So it's a merit-based system in terms of who Canada invites to apply for permanent residency or invites to take part in that. And so they look at things like age, education, work experience, both foreign and in Canada, and language skills. So either English, French, or both. And then there's additional points awarded for things like if you have family in Canada, you can get some points. Importantly, if you have a job offer in Canada or you're already working in Canada, you can get additional points. And really what this is trying to do is ensure that for those that are being invited for permanent residency for economic reasons, they're being chosen based on the merits of how valuable we think that would be to the country, right? So are they, you get more points for being younger, you get more points for strong language skills, you get more points for the more work experience you have, and you get more points for, the different levels of education you would have. So a 25-year-old candidate that has a master's degree and 3 years of experience is going to be chosen over someone that may not have that same experience. And so basically you would set up a profile online, you enter all of your data, you get a point calculation, and then every 2 weeks or so, the country just does a draw. And the top, between 3,000 and 5,000, sometimes more, will just get chosen to apply for PR. And so you know exactly what that criteria is. If you're below the threshold, you know what you can do to improve it. You can improve your language skills, you can get further education, you can get work experience, and kind of work towards improving that score so that when the draws do happen, you would get chosen. And so it's a year-round system. Basically, like I said, every couple of weeks they're doing these draws. And so you're always kind of intaking new people, and you're always choosing from the very top of the group that's wanting to apply. And it's it's not based on countries at all. So if the top 3,000 applicants are all from Brazil, that's going to be what gets chosen, right? So it's all based on that same merit that's kind of worldwide, just based on like meeting that criteria.
No, it's fascinating, and I'll pass it back to you, Eric, in a minute. But famously, there's these social media posts that go viral of these immigrants in the U.S. who are PhDs or have master's degrees, just very accomplished individuals. Who either don't get selected into the H-1B lottery, or maybe they're from India or China, and they're stuck in the green card backlog for, like you said, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and they leave the U.S., oftentimes going to Canada. So the fact that Canada doesn't have that per country cap and is always welcoming those folks, especially the most accomplished, is in high contrast to the randomness we seem to have here in the U.S. But Eric, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, Arif and Finn, as we're recording this, we are almost, so March 3rd, the H-1B lottery in the States did open up March 1st, the electronic registration system, and I think it's going to be until like the middle of the month. And Arif, as you mentioned, only 85,000 total visas. last year, I believe it was a record number of registrations submitted, and Finn number check me if I'm wrong, but I think it was like over 480,000 registrations were submitted.
Mm-hmm.
So the odd, someone can do the odds on being selected. Canada does not have an H-1B lottery, and I think it's one of the biggest differences between the two immigration systems. For an employer, let's play out like a hypothetical. For a U.S. based employer who submits a registration for an employee and they're not selected, but the employer really wants to bring this employee on board, how can they? Is Canada an H-1B alternative, or can Canada be an H-1B alternative?
Definitely can. And I know it is for a lot of folks. So if you were to look at companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, they all have very large presences in Canada, large and growing presences in Canada. And it's generally for a couple of reasons. Obviously, there's a lot of engineering talent here that they want to be able to access, which is important. But another key reason is that for those that they either want to bring to the U.S. from abroad who don't win the lottery, or those that are in the U.S. and can't stay, like if you were on a STEM OPT visa and you have your final chance at the lottery, and like you said, it's like a 20 or 30% chance each time, depending on the number of people who register. Even if you have 3 chances, there's a good chance that it won't work. They often bring those people to Canada on work permits or through a permanent residency program or both. And so it's certainly possible. It's a little bit harder to do as a new company. It's a little bit harder to do as a smaller company. And the reason I say that is that for the new aspect, some of these programs, in order to access them, you have to show a record of good standing in Canada and having, existed here, having an office here, having employed people here that are Canadians. And like I said at the beginning, there's, in some of the cases, especially with the global talent stream, commitments you need to make to show that you're going to better the lives of Canadians and permanent residents. And so if you're brand new, you're not going to have any of that. So it makes it somewhat challenging to do, if you're thinking about this now for, the upcoming lottery. And if you're smaller, it's a little bit challenging only because it's tough to do a second entity in a different country without doing it at scale, right? So if you think about figuring out office space, figuring out health benefits, figuring out a payroll provider, figuring out all the different things required to operate in a new country, whether you need HR, whether you need ops, like all those things. If you're only going to do this for like 2 people, it generally is, a lot more trouble than it can be potentially worth. And, it's where someone like a company like us can definitely help. But it's definitely doable. And we know a lot of companies that do use Canada as that, kind of plan B or backup plan for those that either don't win the lottery, or like you said, we've got people that have just been on the green card list for 10 years or 12 years. And they're like, I can't keep going through this cycle and want an alternative, or they have a spouse that can't work in the U.S. because they didn't get the H-4 EAD, or like there's some complication related to that. Or, in those cases, like there's always, people looking at Canada and ways to help there.
What suggestions do you have for employers at this moment, or with the lottery upon us? What suggestions do you have for them to think about now, but also in the future? Maybe their 2023 or 2024 immigration programs within their company.
Yeah, so I think it is definitely worth exploring, if it hasn't been done already, like Canada as that destination for talent, right? And I think it's a few ways you can look at it. So those you have in the U.S. who can't stay or don't want to stay, Canada can be that alternative. Those you have abroad that you want to bring in, Canada can be that alternative, because you're able to bring them in year round, not just based around a lottery, and it's not a 20 or 30% chance of success. Like it's quite a bit higher, and it's a lot quicker. Just in the sense that, these work permits, like I said, can be done as little as 4 weeks, sometimes 6 or 8 weeks, but very quick, as opposed to even if you win the lottery in March, it takes till October for someone to actually get, into the country. So there's lag there that you can avoid. Shamelessly plugging us. I would advise people to just reach out to our company, like go to mobsquad.io and click get started, and we can have that conversation. And, we're very honest and upfront where, like, if we think it makes sense for you to do it yourself, we'll just be like, that's what you should do, and here's how. If we think it actually makes sense for us to help because we've done all this legwork already, then we'll, go down that path. But, we're always happy to entertain the conversations and try and see what the specific situations are, because, when it's subscale and when it's immediate, like, it's generally helpful to have a partner. If you're well established, if you've got a Canadian operation, we can certainly guide you on the right path there as well.
Totally. Before we dive a little bit deeper into Canada as a growing destination for employers and U.S.-based employers, are just curious to hear your thoughts. Are there any components of the U.S. immigration system that you like?
Yes, I mean, I think some of it gets back to some of the similarities. So, I do think that narrowing down the occupation lists is something that is obviously helpful, because you want to focus your immigration on areas of need, which the U.S. does, through the H-1B and other visa streams. I think there are some helpful systems depending on certain countries, like, there's L1 intercompany transfers that are available in some cases. There's TN visas that are available in some cases. So in certain, countries where there's that strong kind of either trade or immigration relationship, there's pathways that I think can prove super useful. And I know a lot of Canadians who are in the U.S. on TNs and successfully working there. So definitely options there. And then I think, I think there are important guardrails that you want in place, which the U.S. does have, right? So like some of those wage guardrails where you do want to protect to make sure that you're not just bringing in folks that are going to undercut the local market and cause displacement of existing workers. Like, that's definitely not the idea. And so I think, having these guardrails is smart and is, worthwhile doing. So those are some areas I think that are good about the system, and help.
So, Arif, we sent you a copy before we had this chat of Envoy's 2023 Immigration Trends Report, and there were some interesting stats in there that we wanted to get your reaction on. So just quick background for the audience. Envoy surveyed 500 HR professionals who specialize in corporate immigration and global mobility for companies based across the U.S. Arif, two stats I want to read off to you and just get your reaction. 62% of respondents in our survey said that they moved foreign national employees to Canada because of immigration-related issues in the U.S. And 87% of respondents in our survey said that they prefer the Canadian immigration system over the U.S.'s because it's more employer-friendly.
Yes, I mean, firstly, not super surprised, given what we've talked about over the last, 40 minutes here. That all, kind of tracks. So that does make sense. And I mean, given the business we're in, we talk to companies every day who are either considering this or have done this or want to do this in some way, shape, or form. And so that all does make sense. It's logical that for companies in the U.S., it's easiest to look either north or south directly. And Canada makes a lot of sense because, there's a lot of congruency, right, between the countries. There's obviously, we share, language congruency, we share business culture congruency, we share time zone congruency. And so, looking at Canada makes a lot of sense. If you're a New York-based company, being in a Toronto or Halifax, or having some sort of presence there, can certainly help. And, in SF, similarly, being in Calgary or Vancouver can really help, because you basically have folks along the same timeline, that are able to continue working with the team, which is critical. And then, some of the, I think, things we highlighted on the Canadian system being year-round, being quicker, being a little more agile, and being less focused on country caps and more on merit. I think the favorability, numbers make sense. And as you said, if 62% are relocating to Canada, people are taking action on this as well.
Yeah, no, the numbers were fascinating, but not surprising, like you mentioned. And you spoke earlier about sort of the revolving door of the Metas and the Amazons, the big tech companies of the world, the revolving door between Seattle and Vancouver or New York and Toronto. And these big companies have, big presences in both the US and Canada for the reasons you stated. For maybe a growing company or a smaller company that has foreign national employees and are facing the same immigration barriers that are preventing them from continuing sponsorship or getting sponsorship in the first place for their employees. What are your recommendations for folks like that on exploring how to set up shop in Canada and maybe relocating some of their foreign talent up there?
Yes, I mean, some of it stems back to what we talked about a little bit before in terms of, establishing yourself and creating those credentials here so that you can access everything. And I mean, depending on the size of the organization and how, how many folks they want to move, both economically and, just from a work standpoint, like this is where someone like us comes in. Like we really want to be able to help with that. And so, what we do just in a small nutshell is, we can basically act as a virtual Canadian subsidiary for entities that are thinking about having talent in Canada, right? So we can hire folks, we can do all of the immigration through all of the streams we've talked about, including Global Talent Stream, Express Entry, and some of the provincial systems as well. We keep folks on our payroll, we handle benefits, we handle, workers' comp and any remittances that are Canadian specific. We have offices across the country. And so, if you're in a situation where you've got people that are in the US and can't stay or didn't win the lottery, or you have people abroad who you weren't able to bring in, we can do this as a super turnkey thing within a matter of weeks. And then you basically get to continue working with this talent on an exclusive and long-term basis from Canada through a company like ours. So, like I said, we have those one-to-one conversations with companies that are considering this. And so I'd encourage people to reach out. If it makes sense for them to do this, we'll send them on that path. If it makes sense for us to help, we will, of course, do that. So just depending on the scale, size, urgency, and all of that it changes in terms of what that answer would be.
So how quickly can you help companies, or can companies work with you, to send talent to Canada if they are not selected in this current or upcoming H-1B lottery?
Yes, I mean, we can work super quickly. Like, as we discussed earlier, the actual immigration for folks, so bringing in, talented technology individuals, can be as quick as 4 weeks. I would budget at least 6 weeks just to allow for some, buffer and timeline for processing. But, it's really, really quick. And in most cases, it's well before someone's visa would expire in the US. The part that can sometimes take time is, obviously having that conversation with the company, explaining how it works, going through contracts, making sure all the pricing makes sense. And so we do encourage companies that, maybe putting folks through the lottery right now to actually reach out now. Because what we would think makes the most sense is, let's have those initial discussions. Let's see if there's a good match here. Let's see if the individual is even interested in coming to Canada. And if all of that lines up, then we just wait for the lottery, right? If the person's able to stay, perfect, no harm done. We've had the conversation and you know that we exist. If the individual is not able to stay, then you've already done all the legwork with us to get to the end point, and we can just sign contracts and start the immigration process right away. So we can get closer to that, 4 to 6 week timeline versus, it taking a few months where you may have to do a lot lead time kind of leading up to the relationship. So we can generally work as quick as companies are willing to work. And that's why, the timing for this is super relevant, because we know so many companies are now basically either entering people into the lottery or have already done so and are waiting for those results anxiously. And so, now's the perfect time to start thinking about, what that backup plan might be, just given the sheer odds of the lottery being, 20 or 30%.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Where can people learn more about Mobsquad?
Yeah, so the best way to do that is just go to our website, mobsquad.io, mobsquad.io, and there's a button you'll see right at the top called Get Started. And so if you're a company, there's a form you'd fill out. We don't ask for too much information because we like to just get on the phone and have that conversation. So it's just, a little bit of basic stuff so we know what we're getting into. And if you're an engineer that's potentially facing, having to leave, then there's a section that you could fill out as well, just explaining your situation. So we can work on either side of that, depending on, who it is. But that just helps us direct traffic to the right folks so that you get the best answers for what you're looking for.
Totally. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about Mobsquad in general?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a couple things. Like we, try and do this on the very premium end and be super bespoke and super, caring to the individuals that we are helping. So for companies, what we want to do for them is basically have anything related to having folks in Canada not be a worry at all. So like you would continue to have people support you on an exclusive and long-term basis, but you wouldn't have to think about how does payroll work, how do benefits work, how does workers' comp work, what are these different remittance programs that are equivalent to Social Security or anything like that. Where will they work? Like we've got the offices, and importantly, all the immigration compliance, right? So we create, not only do we get them in on the expedited work permits, but we put anybody on a path to permanent residency for them and their family, so that they can stay in Canada long term. Like our solution is designed to be long term, and then you never really have to worry about all of that immigration compliance work again, because that's really what we're specialized in. And for engineers that are coming, we really emphasize super empathetic and super white glove service with all of them. So we want to make sure that for a lot of folks, it's their first time ever coming to Canada and they're bringing a family and they've never been here. And we want to make sure that that experience is super positive and kind of gets back to when we were talking at the beginning. It's a really welcoming and friendly feeling when you do make that decision. Like we pick every engineer up at the airport when they arrive. We make sure they have housing, figured out, both temporary and permanent. We try and figure out schools if they have kids. Like we try and find work for their spouses. Like anything that might come up, like we're trying to solve that so that we're doing this in a way that makes their lives great, which, in turn, again, I think is a win-win, because they're super happy and they're more productive, and, their end client is happier because they're not worried about all these other things. So, that's just a little bit of the spiel on, why, I think why we're doing this. And, getting back to the very beginning, why I wanted to be a part of this. It's not just a business for us. Like it's actually really important for us to, help these individuals that we think, are super important and amazing people, but also, help build this talent here and have them be able to keep their North American dream alive in some way.
So what I'm hearing is that the stereotype about Canadians being nice is true.
Yes, fortunately, yes, we do like poutine and we're nice.
Breaking news here on the Immigration Mobility Podcast. I want to ask you, just to wrap it up here, Arif, in a minute, about what your outlook is on Canadian immigration in the future going forward. But first, one thing I forgot to mention earlier is, as I read that Canada recently expanded the ability for visitors to stay in the country after they seek a job. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it might relate to folks who are listening who are looking at Canada as an alternative to the H-1B if the lottery doesn't work out for them.
Yeah, so I'm not sure on that specific policy. I do know that there continue to be efforts to help those that are planning to stay in Canada, that were here on a temporary basis, convert to permanent residency and create paths that allow for that. And I know that this is true for both international students who choose to study in Canada and trying to make that easier for them to stay long term. And I know that this is true as well for people who entered in as temporary residents, whether that was as workers or visitors, to create pathways for them to become permanent residents. So I don't know about this specific program, but I do know that there's a lot of initiative underway to do that, because logically, if you've been here and you like it here and you've worked here or you studied here, we don't want to lose that talent because they're obviously contributing already. And so there's certainly work underway and new programs being announced all the time to help with that. And it speaks a little bit to the agility that I was talking about, where if there's a recognized pathway or a recognized problem, they can create pathways to help solve for that. And then in terms of your first part of that, in terms of where I think I see things going, 2021 and 2022 were each record years for immigration. So there were over 400,000 permanent residents in 2021 and over 430,000 in 2022, which were records, which is especially impressive when you consider that a lot of that was under COVID, that the country still managed to figure out a way to continue to hit those levels plans and reach record immigration. As we talked about earlier, the immigration plans for the next 3 years, according to the levels plan, is to break that record 3 consecutive times. So I do continue to see the trend for immigration being positive, both in terms of the absolute numbers, which is important, but also in terms of the streams where there is the most demand. So there are, as I mentioned, there's a program in Alberta called the Alberta Accelerated Tech Program. There's a program in BC also related to technology. There are additional pathways and additional policy being put in place to allow more career-focused immigration pathways. And so I think for those that are highly, highly qualified and highly skilled, the options are going to continue to increase. as well as a number of immigrants are going to continue to increase. And so I think you'll see, the trends that you've been seeing will largely continue, but just actually, in a more, in a way that scales even faster.
It's fascinating and exciting. That's all I have for you, Eric. Any last questions for Arif?
No, Arif, I think this was a super insightful conversation. Hit on a lot of aspects of Canadian immigration. Yeah, super glad you're able to hop on the show today, and really appreciate you taking the time out to be on here with us, second ever guest. So yeah, super awesome.
Oh, thank you as well. Thank you. I appreciate both of your time, and this was really fun. I hope it helped build some knowledge of Canadian immigration and some local foods and breweries as well.
Totally.
All right, Arif. Well, we appreciate your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Immigration and Mobility Decoded. If you watched this video on YouTube and you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the Envoy Global YouTube channel for more content like this. Otherwise, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone.